I spent 4 years and $187,000 building a house on my parents' land. Then they sold it to my brother behind my back. Dad said, "That contract was just paperwork." My dad was laughing so loud I could hear him through the glass. Football was on. Dylan was on the couch. Everything was normal. At least that's what it looked like from where I was standing, outside in the backyard, splitting firewood by myself. That was kind of the story of my life with this family, honestly. Me outside doing the work. Them inside, enjoying the warmth. It was Thanksgiving morning. Cold enough that I could see my breath with every swing. The axe came down clean, thwack, and the log split perfectly in two. I stacked it against the fence and reached for another one. That's when my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it. I figured it was a work notification, maybe a group chat from some college friends, something I could deal with later. But something made me pick it up. It was an email from Marcus Sterling. Marcus is my lawyer. Has been for about 6 years. He doesn't send me emails on holidays. He doesn't send me emails unless something is actually happening. The subject line read, Coal property, transfer complete. 3 words in the body. It's done. Call me. I stood there for a second, holding my phone, staring at those 3 words. The firewood was still in my left hand. I set it down slowly, against the fence. I didn't go back inside. I didn't storm in through that sliding glass door and flip the turkey off the table. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't do any of the things you might expect a man to do when he finds out his own parents just stabbed him in the back. I sat down on an old tree stump near the back corner of the yard, the one I'd been meaning to pull out for 2 years, and I read the full email. The property sale had gone through. The transfer was complete. And the clause I had insisted on, the clause my father had grumbled about and signed anyway, the clause that had sat in a file folder in my home office for 6 years like a quiet insurance policy, that clause had just been activated. My hands were steady. That surprised me, actually. I noticed them consciously, no trembling, no shaking. Just still, holding the phone, reading words I had honestly hoped I would never need to read. From inside the house, I heard my dad burst out laughing again at something on TV. Dylan said something back. I couldn't make out the words, just that familiar, easy tone he has, the one that sounds like everything has always been fine and always will be. I took a long breath. The cold air hit the back of my throat. Here's the thing people always get wrong about moments like this. They think when something you feared finally happens, it breaks you. But for me, it was almost the opposite. Because I had seen this coming for a long time. Not hoped for it, not wanted it, but prepared for it. The way an engineer thinks about load-bearing walls. You calculate for the worst case, you build for it, and then you hope you never have to test it. I had built for it. And now it was being tested. I put the phone in my jacket pocket. I stood up. I picked up the axe. And I split 3 more logs before I went back inside. Some people, when they get news like that, they need to react immediately. They need the confrontation, the tears, the big dramatic moment. That's never been me. I've always believed the same thing, that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous one. I wasn't loud that morning. I was quiet. What I didn't know yet, what I'm about to tell you, is that by the time this family sat down for Thanksgiving dinner, everything was already in motion. A machine I had built years ago, just in case, had already started running. And there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. Before I get into what happened next, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your state in the comments. I'll be reading every single one. Nobody wanted 800 words to understand why I did what I did. You have to understand what that property actually was before I touched it. My parents have owned a 3-acre lot about 20 minutes outside of town for as long as I can remember. It came to them through my grandfather. His side of the family had bought it decades ago, and when he passed, it became theirs. Growing up, they always talked about it like it was this great inheritance, this piece of land that made us different from people who were just renting forever. And look, in theory, it was valuable. 3 acres is not nothing. Good-sized lot, decent location, not too far from the highway. If you had taken care of it, it could have been something real. The problem was the rental units. At some point, probably in the 80s, the previous owner had built a cluster of small rental units on part of the property. 4 of them side by side, the kind of basic, no-frills housing that was common back then. My parents inherited those too, and for a while it worked. The units brought in rental income. Not a lot, but enough to feel like the property was paying for itself. But by the time I'm talking about 6 years ago, when this whole story really begins, those units were a disaster. I'm a construction engineer. I've been doing this work for over a decade. I know what a building looks like when it's been ignored, and I know what it costs to bring it back. When I walked that property 6 years ago, really walked it with a legal pad and a trained eye, what I saw wasn't a family asset. It was a liability wearing the mask of one. The roofs on 2 of the units were compromised. Not needs some patching compromised, but water is actively getting in and has been for years compromised. One unit had a plumbing issue that had gone unaddressed so long it had caused structural damage to the subfloor. The electrical in the oldest building was outdated enough to be a fire risk. One of the 4 units had already been condemned by the county following a tenant complaint inspection. And the county wasn't staying quiet about it either. My parents had already received 2 formal violation notices. Each one came with a deadline and a dollar amount attached, fees that grew the longer nothing was done. A 3rd notice was likely coming. If it did, the county had the authority to step in, demolish at will, and bill my parents for the cost. My father knew all of this. He just didn't talk about it in those terms. What my father said whenever the subject came up was, "It just needs a little work. We'll get to it." He'd been saying that for at least 4 years. My mother's version was slightly different. Hers was, "Maybe when Dylan gets more settled, he can help us figure it out." Dylan, at this point, had been in San Francisco for 4 years. He was working at a startup, or so we were told. The details changed every time someone asked. Head of Growth, VP of Operations, leading a new product division. The titles shifted like weather, but the message was always the same. Dylan was out there doing big things, and any day now it was going to pay off in a serious way. My parents believed this completely. I believed it the way I believe things I can't verify, which is to say, I held it loosely and kept my own counsel. So there I was, standing on a piece of land that should have been a real asset, watching it slowly become a financial and legal problem for my parents, who didn't have the money to fix it or the expertise to manage it. My dad had retired. My mom had never worked full-time. They were comfortable enough on their own, but they didn't have $150,000 sitting around to pour into a failing property. They didn't even want to say that number out loud. I stood at the edge of the property that afternoon, looking at those 4 sagging units, and I thought about what this land could be if someone actually did the work. I got in my car. I drove home, and I started doing the math. I want to be honest with you. I didn't know yet that I was about to make the biggest single financial and personal decision of my adult life. I thought I was solving a problem. I thought I was helping my family while also helping myself. What I didn't know yet was that this decision would eventually bring me to that backyard on Thanksgiving morning, standing with an axe in my hand and a lawyer's email on my phone. But we'll get there. I spent about 2 weeks doing the numbers before I said a word to anyone. That's just how I work. I don't pitch ideas I haven't stress-tested. I don't make proposals based on optimism. I'm an engineer, I plan, I calculate, I account for variables, and then I come to the table with something concrete. What I came to the table with was this. I would fund the demolition of the old rental units and the construction of a single, well-built family home on the property. I estimated the total cost at around $187,000. A combination of my own savings and a personal construction loan I was prepared to take out. In exchange, I would live in the house as a long-term tenant, paying fair monthly rent to my parents. The property would stay in their name. They would continue to be the legal owners. But, and this was the part one was not willing to move on, there had to be a contract. Specifically, one clause that I considered non-negotiable. If the property was ever sold, for any reason, to any buyer, I would be repaid $240,000 from the proceeds. That number accounted for my construction investment, the loan interest, a fair return on my labor contribution, and a modest projection for market appreciation. If the sale price didn't cover that amount, we had a separate discussion. But if it did, and I was reasonably confident it would, that money came to me first off the top before anyone else saw a dollar. I sat my parents down at their kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon. I brought a printed summary. 1 page, clear language, no jargon. My dad read it in about 45 seconds, which told me he didn't actually read it. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms and said, "Son, why do we need a lawyer involved? I'll shake your hand right now. We're family." I had expected this. I wasn't angry. I looked at him and said, "Dad, a handshake only works if both people are around and remember it the same way. Paper doesn't forget." He made a face like I'd said something vaguely offensive. My mom tried a different angle. She said I was being cold. She said that treating family like a business transaction wasn't how she raised me. I said, "Mom, I'm offering to put almost $200,000 into your property. The contract protects both of us. It means my investment is secure, and it means you can never be accused of taking advantage of me." She was quiet after that. Here's what I didn't say out loud, because I didn't need to. I had watched these two people handle Dylan's financial disasters for years. I knew about the credit card debt they'd quietly covered. I knew about the lease they'd co-signed on his San Francisco apartment when his startup salary turned out to be inconsistent at best. I knew that when Dylan needed something, the family's resources had a way of flowing toward him like water finding its level. I wasn't Dylan. I wasn't asking for anything. I was offering something substantial, and I was asking only that the agreement be documented. My father tried one more time. He said, "Arthur, contracts are for strangers. We're not strangers." I said, "I know we're not. That's why I trust you enough to sign." He didn't like that answer, but he didn't have a good counter to it either. It took another 2 weeks and one visit from a local real estate attorney, a woman named Patricia, who was patient and thorough and explained every clause in plain English, before they both signed. My mother signed first, quickly, like she wanted it over with. My father signed slowly, the way someone signs something they've decided to be unhappy about. He pressed too hard on the pen. The signature came out heavier than it needed to be. I kept the original. My parents got a copy, which they put in a drawer somewhere in their kitchen. I thought about that copy sometimes, over the years that followed. Whether they ever took it out. Whether they ever read the clause again. I wondered if they understood what they had agreed to, or if they'd signed it the way people sign birthday cards, without reading what's actually inside. I think I knew even then, but I told myself I was wrong. I told myself the contract was just a formality, the kind of thing that exists so everyone can sleep at night, and that it would sit untouched in a file folder for the next 30 years. I got to work. What happened over the next 4 years was something I'm genuinely proud of, and I'll tell you about it in a moment. But I need you to hold on to something first. My father signed that contract. So did my mother, with a licensed attorney present, in their own kitchen with full knowledge of every clause. That signature would mean everything later, and they had completely forgotten what it said. I want to tell you something about building a house from scratch. It's not romantic. It's not like those renovation shows on TV where someone cries happy tears at the reveal and everything looks perfect under good lighting. It's dirty, it's exhausting, it costs more than you planned, and there are weeks where you wonder what you were thinking. But there is nothing like standing inside something you built with your own hands and knowing it's yours. I broke ground in early spring. The first thing we did was demolish the old units. I brought in a small crew for that. You can't do demolition safely alone, and we spent the better part of a week taking those 4 sagging structures down to the ground. My parents came out to watch the first day. My mom looked a little sad. My dad nodded like he was watching something necessary, which I suppose he was. Once the lot was clear, the work really began. I wasn't doing this as a full-time job. I was still working my regular position as a construction engineer, managing commercial projects during the day. This house was what I did in the evenings, on weekends, on holidays. I subcontracted the electrical and the plumbing. Those require licensed specialists and I'm not too proud to admit my limits, but everything else I was either doing myself or standing 3 feet away supervising. I poured the foundation on a Saturday in July. It was 91 degrees. I had 2 guys helping me and we were out there in the heat for 11 hours straight. By the end of the day, I was so sunburned I could barely put a shirt on, and my lower back was telling me things I didn't want to hear. But when I stood at the edge of that slab that evening and looked at it in the low orange light, perfectly level, solid, exactly where I had planned it to be, I felt something settle inside me. That was the foundation. Everything else would rest on that. The framing went up over several weekends in the fall. I installed the kitchen cabinets myself over a long weekend in February. Got the alignment wrong twice, had to pull them and rehang them, nearly threw a level across the room. But the third time they went up straight and true and I stood back and looked at them and felt that same quiet satisfaction. Small victories. That's what 4 years of this looks like. Not one big dramatic moment. Just hundreds of small victories, stacked on top of each other. Until one day you walk through a door and realize it's actually a home. I moved in on a Thursday evening in late October. No party, no announcement. I loaded my truck, drove over, carried my boxes inside, and stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and just listened to how quiet it was. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, an open-plan kitchen that got good morning light. A covered porch in the back that I had designed specifically so you could sit outside even when it was raining. Hardwood floors I had sanded and finished myself. A deep backyard with room to breathe. I paid my parents' rent every month like clockwork. Direct deposit first of the month every single month without fail. Fair market rate. I had it appraised so neither of us could argue about the number. I wasn't looking for charity and I wasn't offering it. That first spring, I planted grass seed in the backyard. I spent a Saturday on my hands and knees working it into the soil, then watered it every morning before work. By mid-May, there was a thin green film covering the ground. By June, it was a real lawn. I mowed it myself every week. I had a neighbor over for dinner. I had work colleagues over for a cookout in the summer. I dated someone for a few months. It didn't work out, for reasons unrelated to anything in this story, and I was okay. Actually okay, not performing okay. I was genuinely, quietly content. And all the while, Dylan was out in San Francisco. Every few months, my mother would mention him in a phone call. Dylan's working on something really exciting. Dylan says this new company has a lot of potential. Dylan's thinking about pivoting his strategy. The language was always the same, forward-looking, full of possibility, never quite landing. I listened. I said the right things. I went back to my lawn, my porch, my kitchen cabinets that I had hung 3 times until they were perfect. I had built something real. I just didn't know yet that someone else had already decided it belonged to them. He showed up on a Tuesday. No warning, no phone call ahead of time. My mother called me that evening, and I could hear it in her voice before she even said his name. That particular brightness she gets, like a light switching on, the one that's always been reserved specifically for Dylan. "Your brother's home," she said. He had driven from San Francisco. Showed up at their front door with a duffel bag, a leased car that I later found out he was 3 payments behind on, and the kind of energy that I can only describe as a man actively rebranding himself in real time. He didn't say he'd failed. Of course he didn't. What Dylan said, and I'm not paraphrasing because my mother repeated this to me verbatim, clearly charmed by it, was that he was taking a strategic pause to realign his focus with higher impact opportunities. 6 years. 6 years of startups that never launched, titles that meant nothing, and a salary that apparently existed mostly on paper. And he came home calling it a strategic pause. I'll give him this. Dylan has always known his audience. And his audience, the one that has never once asked for receipts, was sitting right there in that living room, thrilled to have him back. My parents asked me to come to Sunday dinner that week. I went. I'm not someone who avoids things. Dylan looked good, actually. Rested. He'd grown a beard. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, which was a change from the Silicon Valley hoodie and laptop aesthetic I remembered. He hugged me at the door and clapped me on the back, and he said, "I remember this clearly. Bro, your house looks incredible. You really built something there." I said, "Thanks." He held eye contact for just a beat too long. I noticed it. I filed it away. Dinner was loud and warm, and my mother had made pot roast, which is Dylan's favorite and has never once been mine. But that's a small thing. My dad was in a good mood. Dylan told a story about a celebrity investor he'd met at a conference in Austin that had the table laughing. He was charming. He's always been charming. That's not the same thing as being trustworthy. But at a dinner table, it's hard to tell the difference. After dinner, while my mom was in the kitchen, my dad leaned over to me and said, quietly, "It's good to have him home. He just needs a little time to get back on his feet." I said, "Sure, Dad." That was the end of it that night. But over the next 2 weeks, I started getting phone calls. First, my mother. Casual, friendly, almost like she was just catching up. At the end of the call, as if it had just occurred to her, "Dylan's just going to need a stable base while he figures out his next move. You know? Somewhere he feels grounded." I said, "That makes sense." She paused. "You have so much space over there, Arthur." I said, "I do. I built it that way." Another pause. Then, well, just something to think about. I thought about it. Then I thought about 4 years of evenings and weekends and a July foundation pour in 91-degree heat. 3 days later, my father called. He was using his measured voice, the one he only brings out when he's rehearsed what he wants to say. He talked for a while about family responsibility, about how Dylan had always been the one who needed a different kind of support, about how Arthur, me, had always been the strong one who could handle things. Then he got to the point. He thought I should consider stepping back from the house temporarily, renting somewhere nearby, maybe just for a year or so, while Dylan used the property to get stable. It would only be temporary. Family has to make sacrifices for each other sometimes. I let him finish. Then I asked one question. "Dad, what about the contract?" Silence. Not a short silence. A long one. The kind where you can feel someone on the other end of the phone deciding how to respond. Finally, he said, "That was never meant to be permanent, son. That was just paperwork to make you feel comfortable at the time. I want you to sit with that for a second." A legally notarized contract, drafted by a licensed attorney, signed by both parties, witnessed and filed, described as just paperwork to make you feel comfortable. I kept my voice level. "I'll think about it, Dad. Let me call you back." I hung up. I walked to my home office. I opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, where I keep important documents in labeled folders. I found the folder marked Coal Property, Contract. I took it out. I sat at my desk. I reread every clause slowly, the way I hadn't needed to in 2 years because I had already memorized the important parts. The clause was still there. Clean, clear, unambiguous. I didn't call Marcus yet, but I saved his number to my favorites that night. Because here's what I knew, sitting at that desk. My father hadn't asked whether I was willing to negotiate. He had asked whether I still had my leverage. Now he knew. I want to be honest about something. There was a part of me, a small part but a real one, that hoped it would stop after that phone call with my dad. I hoped he'd think about it, realize he was asking something unreasonable, and quietly let it go. I have never wanted conflict with my family. Not then, not now. But that's not what happened. What happened instead was 6 weeks of what I can only describe as a coordinated pressure campaign. I don't think they called it that. I don't think they sat around a table and planned it out strategically. But looking back, it had a shape to it, an escalation, a structure, one attempt building on the last. Week 1, my mother came by the house in person. Unannounced. She brought a casserole dish, the kind of gesture that's hard to refuse without looking ungrateful. She walked through my kitchen, complimenting the countertops, ran her hand along the cabinets, looked out the back window at the yard. Then she said, almost to herself, "Dylan always did love a yard like this." I said, "There's casserole dish in the fridge." "Thank you, Mom." She left. I stood in my kitchen for a while after she was gone. Week 2, my father tried a different angle. He called me on a Wednesday evening and told me I had always been the strong one in the family, the independent one. I didn't need as much support as Dylan did. Dylan had struggled in ways that I, apparently, couldn't fully understand because things had always come more naturally to me. I'm a construction engineer who worked nights and weekends for 4 years to build a house from scratch. Things have never just come naturally to me. I've worked for every single thing I have. But I understood what he was doing, so I just listened. At the end of the call, he said, "An apartment nearby would still be a good home, son. And it would free up something that could really help your brother get back on his feet." I said, "I hear you, Dad. I'll think about it." I was thinking about it, just not in the direction he wanted. Week 3 was the one that told me this was more serious than I had wanted to believe. My phone rang and it was my Aunt Cheryl, my father's sister, a woman I had not spoken to in 2 full years, who lived in another state, who had never once called me to discuss my living situation. She opened with how long it had been since we talked. She asked about my job. She mentioned she had heard I was doing really well for myself. And then, so smoothly it might have been rehearsed, she said she hoped I would think carefully about what family really means during hard times. Social triangulation. That's what that is. Bringing in a third party to apply pressure that feels less like a demand and more like community consensus. I recognized it. I let her finish. I told her it was good to hear from her. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a few minutes. They had called in outside help. That told me they were more committed to this than I had hoped. Week 4 was when something shifted in the tone. My father called again, and this time the warmth was thinner. He told me the contract had been signed under difficult circumstances, that I had taken advantage of a situation where they were stressed and not thinking clearly, that a good son wouldn't hold his own parents to something that was hurting the family. I kept my voice even. I said, "You had a lawyer in the room, Dad. You had time to think about it." He said the lawyer was mine. I pointed out that Patricia had been recommended by their own neighbor and that my parents had been welcome to bring anyone they wanted to that signing. He didn't respond to that. What he said instead, almost at the end of the call, was, "Do you still have your copy of that contract?" I paused, just for a second. "Yes," I said. "I do." Long silence. Then, "All right, we'll talk more later." He hung up. I set my phone down on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. That question wasn't casual. He wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was checking. He was trying to find out whether the documentation still existed, whether there was still something standing between what he wanted and what he was planning to do. I got up, walked to my home office, and moved the contract folder from the bottom drawer to the top drawer, closer to reach, easier to find in a hurry, because I had a feeling I was going to need it soon, and I had absolutely no idea yet just how right I was. It was a Wednesday morning. I was at my desk at work, halfway through a structural review on a commercial project downtown, when my phone lit up with a number I recognized but didn't expect. Carol. Carol is my neighbor. Has been since the day I moved in. She's in her mid-60s, retired schoolteacher, keeps a garden that she tends like it's a second career. She's the kind of neighbor who waves when you pull into the driveway but doesn't appear at your door uninvited. Quiet, observant, not a gossip. That's the thing about Carol. She doesn't call unless something is actually worth calling about. I picked up. "Arthur," she said. "I'm sorry to bother you at work. I just wanted to make sure you knew. There are some men over on your parents' property this morning. They've got surveying equipment, and there's a woman in a blazer taking photographs. I figured you must know about it, but I wanted to check." I kept my voice neutral. "What kind of car are they driving?" She described it. A dark SUV with a magnetic sign on the door. She read me the name on it slowly, carefully, the way she used to read spelling words to third graders. It was a regional real estate development company. I thanked Carol, told her everything was fine, hung up. For about 30 seconds I just sat at my desk and looked at the wall in front of me. Then I called my mother. She picked up on the third ring, sounding perfectly normal, perfectly cheerful. I asked her if anything was going on with the property. She said she didn't know what I was talking about. She sounded slightly too casual, the particular casualness of someone being careful. I called my father. Voicemail. I left a short, neutral message asking him to call me back when he had a chance. He didn't call back that day. I left work at lunch. I drove to the county recorder's office. I know exactly how these offices work. I've been in them dozens of times for professional reasons. I know which forms to pull, which databases to search, which clerk to approach. I found what I was looking for in less than 20 minutes. A sales agreement filed 4 days earlier. The entire coal property, all 3 acres, including the structure I had designed, financed, and built with my own hands, sold to the same regional real estate development company whose name Carol had read to me off the side of an SUV. The transaction was in the final stages of escrow. Sale price, $310,000. I stood at the counter and read the document twice, all the way through every line. My name was nowhere on it. There was no notation about an existing encumbrance. No disclosure of the contract clause. Nothing. They had sold the property. My home, the house I had spent 4 years building, and they had not told me, had not consulted me, had not even mentioned to the buyer that there was a legal claim attached to it. I thought about my father asking, in week 4 of the pressure campaign, whether I still had my copy of the contract. I understood now exactly what that question had been about. He had been hoping, maybe, that I had lost it, misplaced it, let it slip into some forgotten drawer the way they had apparently let their copy slip. I hadn't lost anything. I made a copy of the sales agreement at the clerk's counter, paid the small fee, folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I walked out to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and didn't start the engine for a few minutes. Here's what I want you to understand about that moment. I wasn't devastated the way you might expect. The grief I felt wasn't sharp, it was heavy. There's a difference. Sharp grief is surprise. Heavy grief is confirmation. I thought about the foundation I had poured in July heat. I thought about the kitchen cabinets I had hung 3 times. I thought about the porch light I had wired myself, standing in the dark the first night I turned it on, watching it come to life. I thought about my lawn, the grass I had grown from seed on my hands and knees. I thought about the inheritance my parents had been given, a piece of land from their own parents, and what they had chosen to do with it. And then I stopped thinking about all of that, because thinking wasn't what this moment called for. I started the car. I pulled out of the parking lot. And I called Marcus. Marcus picked up on the second ring. That's one of the things I appreciate about him. He doesn't let calls from clients go to voicemail when the situation is time-sensitive, and somehow he always seems to know when it is. I gave him the facts. No editorializing, no emotion. Just the sequence. The surveying crew Carol had seen, the sales agreement I had pulled from the county recorder, the sale price, the timeline. I told him the contract clause had not been disclosed to the buyer. I told him the transaction was in final escrow. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have the original contract?" "Top drawer of my filing cabinet." "Get home and scan it. Send it to me tonight." I said, "Already planning on it." He said, "Arthur, the buyer has a problem they don't know about yet. Let's make sure they find out before this closes." That was the entire call. For minutes, I went home, scanned every page of the contract, and sent it to Marcus before 7 that evening. By 9, he had confirmed receipt and told me he was filing the following morning. Here's what Marcus did, and I want to be clear about this because people sometimes misunderstand what activating a contract clause actually looks like in practice. He did not file a lawsuit against my parents. Not initially. What he filed was a lien, a legal encumbrance against the property, based on the documented contractual obligation that existed prior to the sale. In plain terms, he put a flag on the transaction that said, "This property cannot transfer clean title until an outstanding financial obligation of $240,000 is satisfied." The title company, which was handling the escrow for the real estate development company, discovered the lien within 24 hours. The real estate development company's attorney contacted Marcus within 48 hours of that. They were not pleased. They had conducted a title search before entering into the agreement, and the search had come back clear, because my parents had not disclosed the encumbrance. The development company had signed a purchase agreement on a property they believed was unencumbered, and they were now in escrow on something that was legally complicated. They turned their attention immediately to the coals. What the development company wanted was simple: They wanted this resolved so the sale could close. They had a project timeline. They had capital deployed. They wanted the encumbrance released or satisfied, and they wanted it done quickly. This put my parents in a position they had not anticipated. They had mentally spent that $310,000. I don't know exactly what the plan was, how much was earmarked for Dylan, how much they were keeping, but I know they had expected a clean transaction and a check. Instead, they had a lawyer's letter, a frozen escrow, and a development company pressing them hard to fix a problem that they had created by omitting a material fact from a real estate transaction. I want to be precise here. Not disclosing a known encumbrance to a buyer is not just a family dispute. Depending on how it's handled, it can cross into territory that real estate attorneys take very seriously. Marcus made sure everyone involved understood that. During all of this, I went to work. I came home. I watched the news. I called my college friend Dave one evening and we talked for an hour about nothing in particular. Sports, his kids, a trip he was planning. I didn't mention any of this. I did not contact my parents. Not because I was being cruel, but because there was genuinely nothing useful for me to say. Every conversation I had with them at this point would become a negotiation, and I had nothing to negotiate. The contract said what it said. Marcus was doing what he was supposed to do. The machine was running. Marcus sent the formal legal notice to my parents' home address and their email simultaneously. He sent it on Wednesday. He timed it deliberately. It would arrive the day before Thanksgiving. I didn't ask him to do it that way, I told a friend later. That was just Marcus being Marcus. My mother had called me the week before and asked if I was coming for Thanksgiving. I said yes. I want to explain that decision because people have asked me about it. Why would I show up at that table knowing what I knew, knowing what Marcus had set in motion? Because I believe in finishing things. I believe in looking at situations directly rather than avoiding them. And honestly, she's still my mother. He's still my father. Whatever they had done, I wasn't ready to stop showing up entirely. Not yet. So I drove over Wednesday evening, helped my mom prep the sweet potatoes, watched the evening news with my dad, went to sleep in my old childhood bedroom. Everything surface level normal. Nobody mentioned lawyers or property or contracts. Dylan was there. He'd been staying in their guest room since coming home. He seemed slightly subdued, less performative than usual, but still managed to dominate dinner conversation with a story about a potential investor he was supposedly meeting with in January. I went to bed early. Thursday morning, I was up before anyone else. I made coffee, took a mug outside, and started splitting firewood in the backyard. I do that sometimes when I need to think. The repetitive physical work clears my head in a way that nothing else quite does. At 9:47 in the morning, the postal carrier came to the front door. I heard the knock from the backyard. Heard my dad's footsteps inside. Heard the door open. Thought nothing of it, holiday deliveries, maybe something from a relative. I kept splitting wood. About 3 minutes later, the back door opened. My father stepped outside in his slippers, holding a certified envelope that had been opened. His face was doing something I had never quite seen it do before. A combination of anger and something that looked almost like fear. He held the envelope up. "What is this?" His voice was tight, controlled but only barely. I set the axe down, leaned it against the fence, turned to face him. "That's a legal notice from my attorney," I said. "You were expecting it. You're suing your own family." He said it flatly, like he was still deciding whether to believe it. "I didn't sue anyone, Dad. I filed a lien based on a contract you signed. Those are different things." My mother appeared in the doorway behind him. She had flour on her hands from the biscuits she'd been making. She looked at the envelope, then at me, then at my father. Dylan came out a moment later, still in socks, reading over my father's shoulder. I watched his face change as he got to the relevant clause. The performer's mask slipped for just a second, that specific stillness that comes over a person when they realize a plan has failed. My father's voice rose. "You had this planned. This whole thing. You had this planned from the beginning." "I had a contract from the beginning," I said. "That's not the same as a plan. The plan was for everyone to honor what they agreed to." We're your family, Arthur. I know you are. You're also people who sold a property with a legal encumbrance on it without disclosing it to the buyer. That's not a family matter, that's a real estate matter. Marcus is handling it the right way. My dad pointed at me. That lawyer of yours is going to destroy this family over money. Dad, I said, and I kept my voice completely level. You sold my home to a development company to fund Dylan's comeback. You didn't tell me. You didn't call me. You didn't give me any chance to respond. The contract exists because I knew 6 years ago I already knew that something like this was possible. I hoped I was wrong. I wasn't. Silence. Dylan stepped forward. He had found his footing again, shifted into the voice he uses when he's trying to de-escalate, warm, reasonable, the mediator. Arthur, man, this is bigger than a lawyer and a contract. This is family. We can work this out between us. I looked at him for a long moment. Dylan, I said, you're right that it's bigger than a contract, which is exactly why I made sure there was a contract. Because when things are big, when real money and real homes are involved, a handshake isn't enough. I learned that from watching this family. He didn't have an answer for that. My mother started to cry, quietly, standing in the doorway with flour on her hands, her face crumpling in the way that it does. And I want to be honest, that was the hardest moment of all of it. Not my father's anger. Not Dylan's manipulation. My mother's tears. I walked over to her. I said quietly, Mom, I love you. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because you made an agreement with me and then broke it without a word. That has consequences. It should have consequences. She didn't say anything. I went back inside. I fixed my plate. I sat at the table. Nobody sat with me. I ate my Thanksgiving dinner alone at my parents' kitchen table, in the house I grew up in, while the three of them stood in the backyard talking in low voices about what came next. I finished eating. I washed my plate. I said thank you for the food. And I drove home. The lien held. That's the short version. But let me give you the full picture, because I think you've earned it after coming this far. The real estate development company was not interested in waiting around while a family worked through its issues. They had capital committed, a project timeline, and a purchase agreement on a property that had turned out to carry undisclosed legal obligations. Their attorney made very clear to my parents, and I heard this secondhand through Marcus, that the Coles had a narrow window to resolve the encumbrance or face the possibility of the sale falling through entirely, at which point the Coles would be liable for the development company's costs and potentially facing additional legal exposure for the non-disclosure. My parents had no good options. The money was not yet in their hands, it was sitting in escrow, frozen. Dylan couldn't help them. He had no money. That was the whole reason they'd done this in the first place. They settled. The $240,000 was released from escrow directly to me, per the contract terms, before the sale closed. The development company got their clean title. My parents received the remaining $70,000. $70,000. Split between paying their own attorney fees, covering some of Dylan's existing debts, that leased car, among other things, and whatever was left over for themselves. Not nothing, but not the fresh start anyone had imagined. Dylan rented a room from a coworker. A single room in a house with 2 other people in his late 30s. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because that's what the math produced. As for me, I paid off the construction loan immediately. That felt good in a way that was almost physical, like putting down something heavy I'd been carrying for years. I set aside a solid emergency fund. And then, methodically, the way I do everything, I started looking for a property to buy. Something in my name. Only my name. I found it about 4 months later. A small craftsman-style house on a quiet street, solid bones. A deep backyard, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom and a kitchen with good light. The kind of house where you can hear yourself think. I put down a significant deposit. I signed the papers in a title company office, sitting across from an escrow officer I'd never met before, and when she slid the deed across the table for my signature, I looked at it for a second before I picked up the pen. My name. Only my name. No handshake agreements, no family arrangements, no clauses that someone might someday claim were just paperwork. I signed it, and I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't even realized I'd been holding. I bought grass seed the following October. A Saturday morning, cold but clear, I got down on my hands and knees in the backyard and worked it into the soil the way I had done once before, in a backyard that turned out not to be mine. I watered it every morning before work. The first thin green showed up in early November, just along the sunny edge near the fence. By spring, it was a real lawn. I mowed it myself every week. As for my family, I want to be honest with you here, because I think the honest version is more useful than the clean version. I didn't cut contact. I don't think that would have been right, and I don't think it would have been true to who I am. I sent a card on my parents' anniversary. I responded to texts usually after a day or two. I didn't go to Christmas that first year. I spent it with a friend's family, which was warm and easy in a way that felt necessary. The year after, I went. Briefly. It was strained, careful. The kind of gathering where everyone is performing a version of normal because the alternative is a conversation nobody is ready to have. My mother hugged me too long when I arrived. My father shook my hand at the door. Actually shook it, firmly, looking me in the eye. Neither of us said anything about what that meant. I think we both understood. Dylan wasn't there that year. I don't know exactly where he was. My mother mentioned he was working on something new in another city. I said that sounded good and changed the subject. People ask me sometimes whether I regret any of it, whether I wish I had handled it differently, been softer somewhere, found a way to make it work without the lawyers and the lien and the frozen escrow. Here's my honest answer. I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret that I was prepared. I think about something my father said to me 6 years ago, when I sat him down at that kitchen table with a one-page proposal and a request for a contract. He said, "Son, contracts are for strangers. We're not strangers." He wasn't entirely wrong about that. Contracts are what you use when trust needs a foundation stronger than feelings. And here's what I've learned. In 34 years of life and 4 years of building something real with my own hands, a foundation doesn't lie. It doesn't forget what you asked of it. It holds exactly the weight you designed it to hold, no more, no less. I built mine carefully. It held. If this story hit close to home, if you've ever trusted family with something real and had it cost you, drop a comment. I read every single one. And if you know someone who needed to hear this today, share it with them. Take care of yourselves.